By the time Lot 47 entered the auction ring, every serious breeder had already decided he was not worth buying. He was moderate framed, scarred across one shoulder, and so unimpressive that the auctioneer could not attract a second bid. Then Margaret Hale, a widow managing 38 expensive cows alone, quietly raised her paddle while the room laughed. They assumed grief and inexperience had pushed her into buying the bull her late husband would have rejected. But Margaret was not studying his appearance. She was studying calving ease, maternal balance, feed costs, and daughters that did not yet exist. 5 years later, those daughters would reveal why Margaret had never really bought a bull. She had bought the future of her herd. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, would you have trusted Margaret's plan or followed the breeders who judged Lot 47 by appearance alone? By the time Lot 47 entered the auction ring, Margaret Hale had already watched men spend more money on bulls than she owed on her tractor. The good ones sold fast, big shoulders, heavy hindquarters, thick necks, the kind of bulls that made ranchers lean forward before the auctioneer even finished reading the pedigree. Then Lot 47 walked in and the room changed. He wasn't sick or crippled, he simply wasn't impressive. The bull was moderate framed, deep through the middle, with an old scar along one shoulder, and none of the polished appearance of the animals that had entered before him. The auctioneer started high, but no hands went up, so he dropped the price. Still nothing. Someone behind Margaret chuckled. Looks like they forgot to finish growing that one. A few men laughed, but Margaret didn't. She lowered her eyes to the sale catalog resting across her knees. Lot 47. She had circled his number before sunrise, not because of his picture, but because of the numbers printed underneath it. The auctioneer dropped the price again. Anybody? Silence. A breeder across the aisle shook his head. I wouldn't put him on my cows. Margaret read the page one more time, then raised her paddle. Several heads turned, and the auctioneer pointed immediately. Got one. Anybody else? Nothing. The hammer fell. Sold. For a moment, Margaret remained perfectly still. Then the man beside her leaned closer. You just buy that bull? I did. You know why nobody wanted him? Margaret closed the catalog. I know why I wanted him. Outside the sale barn, the jokes followed her. One breeder recognized Margaret while the bull was being loaded. Thomas would have bought more bull than that. The words hit harder than she expected. Her husband had been dead 18 months, and people still spoke as though every decision Margaret made needed to pass through the judgment of a man who was no longer there. She looked toward the trailer where Lot 47 stood quietly inside. The breeder folded his arms. I'm serious, Margaret. What do you see in him? Margaret looked at the bull, and for a moment she remembered Thomas standing beside another sale ring many years earlier. He had asked her a question she hadn't understood then, but now she did. Margaret picked up the catalog. I'm not looking at him. The breeder laughed. Then what are you looking at? Margaret glanced at the cattle waiting beyond the pens, cows, heifers, and calves that didn't exist yet. Then she climbed into her truck. As the trailer pulled away, the breeder was still standing there, shaking his head. Everyone at that auction thought Margaret Hale had bought the bull nobody wanted. They didn't understand that Margaret hadn't gone there simply to buy a bull. She had gone there to buy the cows she wanted 5 years from now. From the county road, Margaret's herd looked fine, and that was part of the problem. 38 cows grazed across the west pasture, broad-backed and heavy enough to make passing ranchers slow down and look. Thomas had spent years building them. People knew the Hale cattle, and Margaret was proud of that, but pride didn't pay the feed bill. The first warning came during winter. Margaret stood inside the barn one January evening, staring at the last stack of hay, which was disappearing faster than she'd expected. The cows were big. Big cows ate, and when grass stopped growing, every extra pound of cow had to be maintained with something Margaret bought, hauled, stored, or grew herself. Thomas had managed it when feed was cheaper, and both of them were working the farm. Margaret was managing it alone. Then calving season came. At 2:17 one morning, she found a young cow struggling in the maternity pen. Margaret waited, then waited longer. But something wasn't right, so she called the veterinarian. By sunrise, there was a live calf on the ground and an exhausted cow beside it. Margaret stood near them, with blood on her sleeve and a veterinary bill coming. The calf was big, and everyone would admire it in a few months. But that morning, Margaret didn't. She looked at the cow instead. You shouldn't have had to work that hard, she whispered. It wasn't the only difficult birth that spring. Not every cow had trouble, And not every calf was oversized, but there were enough problems to make Margaret start asking questions Thomas had once asked. What was she actually breeding for? At weaning, Earl Bennett stopped beside the pasture. Those calves look good. They do. Some real weight there. Margaret nodded. That was what everyone saw, weight, because big calves brought money. But Margaret's eyes moved past them toward their mothers. Large, high-maintenance cows, a herd built around producing more pounds even when the farm supporting those pounds was becoming harder for her to afford. That evening, Margaret opened her records. She didn't begin with the calves, she began with the cows. Which ones had calved without assistance, which maintained themselves well, which consistently raised a healthy calf, and which daughters would she actually want to keep? By midnight, several names had been crossed out. Margaret leaned back and stared at the list. Her herd wasn't failing. That would have been easier to recognize. It was doing something more dangerous, succeeding in a direction her farm could no longer afford to follow. Somewhere in Thomas's old notebooks was a sentence Margaret had ignored for years, and the next morning she found it. Don't buy the bull for the cow standing in front of you. Below it, Thomas had written, buy the cow you want 5 years from now. The first time Thomas said it, Margaret thought he was joking. They had been married 6 years and were standing at a bull sale 2 counties north. Margaret was 32 then. Thomas still had black in his beard, and their herd was small enough that every breeding decision felt enormous. A bull entered the ring that afternoon and immediately caught Margaret's attention. He was massive, thick across the shoulders, wide through the hindquarters, and polished for the sale. That one, Margaret whispered. Thomas glanced at her. Why? Look at him. I am. He's the best bull we've seen all day. Thomas smiled. Best at what? Margaret frowned. Being a bull. Thomas laughed and handed her the sale catalog. Try again. She looked at the numbers, but didn't understand why he cared so much about them. He's big. So are our cows. Isn't that good? Depends what we're trying to build. Margaret looked back toward the ring. Thomas pointed toward another bull waiting behind the gate. He wasn't as impressive, and Margaret barely remembered noticing him, but Thomas did. Don't look at the bull for a minute, he said. That's difficult at a bull sale. Look at our pasture. Margaret rolled her eyes. Our pasture is 40 miles away. Exactly, so put it in your head. He began asking questions. How much grass did they have? How much winter feed could they afford? Which cows had needed help calving? Which females stayed productive without demanding more than the farm could provide? Margaret slowly stopped looking at the animals in the ring and started seeing their herd. Then Thomas said the words she would remember decades later. Never buy a bull just for the cow you have today, Maggie. He tapped the catalog. Buy him for the cow you want 5 years from now. Margaret looked confused. We're buying a bull? No. Thomas pointed toward a group of cows outside the sale barn. We're buying half the genetics of every calf he sires. Then he pointed toward the heifers. And if we keep his daughters, we're making decisions about cows that haven't even been born yet. That silenced her. Years later, after Thomas was gone, Margaret sat alone at her kitchen table with Lot 47's catalog page beside his old notebook. Now the lesson felt different. She wasn't choosing an animal for one breeding season, she was choosing a direction. Margaret drew 2 columns on a sheet of paper. In the first she wrote, what my herd is. In the second, what my farm needs. The lists didn't match. Margaret stared at them for a long time, then circled one sentence in Thomas's notebook. 5 years from now. That was when she stopped searching for the biggest bull she could afford and started searching for the bull that could help build cows she could afford to keep. Margaret spent 3 weeks looking for the wrong bull, at least. That was how Earl described it. Every evening, she sat at the kitchen table with sale catalogs spread around Thomas's old notebook. She crossed out some bulls almost immediately. Others survived until she compared them with her cow records. Then she crossed those out too. One afternoon, Earl stopped by and found her surrounded by papers. You buying cattle or doing taxes? Trying to avoid an expensive mistake. He picked up one catalog. This one looks good. He is. Then what's wrong with him? Nothing. Margaret turned the catalog around. He just isn't what I need. That was the part people kept missing. Margaret wasn't searching for the bull that won every column. She was searching for balance. Calving ease mattered because she remembered those long nights in the barn. Growth still mattered because calves eventually had to pay bills. Maternal information mattered because some daughters would stay, and none of those numbers excused bad feet, bad legs, or an animal unable to work. Then Margaret found Lot 47. Nothing about his page demanded attention. Other bulls had stronger growth figures, and others had photographs that made them look impossible to ignore. Lot 47 wasn't the champion of any single column, and Margaret almost turned the page. But then she placed her cow records beside his information. Difficult births, large mature cows, rising feed requirements, and replacement females she wanted to moderate rather than make larger. The bull wasn't perfect, but his strengths lined up unusually well with the weaknesses Margaret wanted to correct. She reached for Thomas's notebook. Don't breed numbers to numbers. Breed strengths to weaknesses. Margaret circled Lot 47, and that circle was still around his number when she raised her paddle at the auction weeks later. When everyone else refused to bid, Margaret bought him. But buying Lot 47 didn't mean she was ready to turn him out with her cows. The catalog described genetic possibilities. It didn't tell her whether the bull standing in her trailer was reproductively sound that spring. So, after bringing him home, Margaret made an appointment, not with another breeder but with Dr. Samuel Reed. Before Lot 47 ever entered her breeding pasture, Margaret wanted one more question answered. Could the bull she'd selected on paper physically do the job? Thomas had taught her to think 5 years ahead, but he had also taught her never to gamble an entire breeding season on assumptions. Dr. Samuel Reed arrived before Margaret planned to turn Lot 47 out with the cows. The bull stood inside the holding pen while the veterinarian unloaded his equipment. You bought him, and you still don't trust him? Earl asked. I trust why I bought him. Margaret nodded toward the pen. That's different from knowing he's ready to breed. The examination began with the animal himself, his eyes, feet, legs, body condition, and reproductive structures. Anything that might prevent Lot 47 from successfully finding and breeding cows mattered more now than how he'd looked beneath auction lights. Reed watched him move, and the old shoulder scar caught Margaret's attention. That bother him? Not that I can see. Then came the part nobody at the auction could have judged from the bleachers. Dr. Reed measured scrotal circumference and collected a semen sample. Margaret stopped talking. Under magnification, he evaluated sperm motility and morphology as part of the breeding soundness examination. Earl watched from the fence. You nervous? Yes. Thought the catalog said he was good. The catalog told me why I wanted his genetics. Margaret kept her eyes on Dr. Reed. This tells me whether he's a satisfactory breeding prospect today. Minutes passed, then Dr. Reed finally returned. Well? Margaret asked. He meets the standards for a satisfactory potential breeder. Earl grinned. So he passed. For today, Doctor. Reed said, and Margaret noticed those two words. For today. The examination wasn't a guarantee. It couldn't promise every cow would become pregnant, and it couldn't predict injury, illness, libido, or what the calves would eventually become. It was a snapshot of reproductive soundness at that point in time, and that was enough. Margaret looked toward Lot 47. The catalog had helped her choose a direction. The examination had removed one obvious reason not to begin. Now the real test would leave the paper entirely and move into the pasture, into pregnancies, calves seasons, and eventually daughters. Margaret opened the gate leading toward the breeding pasture, and Earl stepped aside. You've been waiting a long time for this. Margaret watched Lot 47 walk through. No. She thought about Thomas's 5-year rule. The waiting starts now. By the end of Lot 47's first week in the breeding pasture, half the county had heard about him. Earl called him the widow's bargain bull, Frank Miller preferred the reject, and Margaret heard both names but ignored them. Lot 47 bred cows, then nothing happened, at least nothing anyone driving past could see. That was the uncomfortable thing about breeding cattle. The decision happened first, while evidence arrived months or even years later. Margaret recorded breeding activity and watched for cows returning to heat. Then came another period of waiting. Weeks later, Dr. Reed returned for pregnancy checks. That morning mattered more to Margaret than any joke she'd heard since the auction. One open cow meant little by itself, while several could mean many things, including management, cow fertility, timing, or bull performance. Margaret knew better than to blame or credit one animal for everything, so she waited as Dr. Reed worked through the herd. Pregnant, 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 open pregnant. Margaret wrote each result down. By the end, there were enough confirmed pregnancies for the breeding season to move to its next question. Lot 47 had gotten cows bred, but Margaret still didn't know whether she'd made the right genetic decision. Pregnancy couldn't tell her that, neither could the bull's scar or his sale price. The calves would begin answering it, but even they wouldn't provide the final answer. One evening, Margaret watched the pregnant cows moving toward water, and Earl stopped beside her. "So I guess your bargain bull proved everybody wrong." Margaret shook her head. "He proved he can breed cows." "Isn't that the point?" "It's the first point." She looked across the herd. Inside those cows were combinations of genetics Margaret had studied months earlier. Some calves would disappoint her, some might surprise her, and somewhere among them might be females she'd keep long enough to become cows themselves. Winter settled over the farm, and Margaret filled her calendar with expected calving dates. Beside the earliest one, she drew a small circle. At 1:43 one February morning, the barn monitor woke her. One of her young females was in labor. Margaret pulled on her boots and ran outside. The bull nobody wanted had cleared his first test, and now his first calf was coming. Margaret reached the barn at 1:51. The young cow was on her side, breathing hard. Margaret checked the clock, then the cow, and then the clock again. She had promised herself she wouldn't interfere, simply because she was nervous. Thomas used to say impatience had pulled more calves than necessity ever did, so Margaret waited. The cow stood, turned, and lay down again. 2 feet appeared, then a nose. Margaret crouched behind the gate, watching carefully. The calf was coming in the right position, but she still didn't relax. She remembered another February night 2 years earlier, a different young cow, and a much harder delivery. The veterinarian had arrived before sunrise, and Thomas had still been alive then. He had stood beside Margaret afterward, looking at the oversized calf lying in the straw. "Big calf," she'd said. Thomas hadn't sounded impressed. "Has to get here first." Now, Margaret understood. The cow pushed again. More of the calf appeared, and with one final effort, it was suddenly on the ground. Margaret looked at the clock. It was 2:17. For several seconds, the calf didn't move, and Margaret's stomach tightened, then it lifted its head and she exhaled. The mother turned immediately and began licking it. Margaret stayed behind the gate. There were no pulling chains, no frantic telephone call, and no veterinarian racing down a frozen county road, just a cow and her calf doing what Margaret desperately wanted them to be able to do. Within half an hour, the calf began trying to stand. It wasn't enormous, and no breeder would have walked into the barn and called it extraordinary. Its legs shook, it fell, tried again, then finally stood long enough to find its mother. Margaret watched it nurse. She should have felt victorious, but instead she opened the notebook she carried in her coat and wrote, "Dam 18, unassisted, calf vigorous." Then she stopped. One calf proved almost nothing. Good cattle could produce bad calves, and bad decisions could get lucky once. Margaret knew better than to turn one easy birth into proof that Lot 47 had changed anything. At sunrise, Earl's truck pulled into the yard, and he found Margaret leaning against the barn door. "Well?" She pointed inside. Earl looked at the calf. "That's it?" Margaret raised an eyebrow. "What were you expecting?" "Something bigger." Margaret looked at the calf standing beside its mother, then smiled. "At birth?" She closed the notebook. "Good." Earl didn't understand why, not yet, because everyone had been waiting to see whether the bull nobody wanted could produce an impressive calf. Margaret was waiting to see whether he could produce something far more useful, a pattern. The second calf arrived 3 nights later. Margaret found it before breakfast, already standing beside its mother, and wrote, "Dam 24, unassisted, calf vigorous." 2 calves still did not make a pattern. Then came the third, the fourth, and the sixth. Not every birth was easy. One cow needed assistance, another calf was slower to stand than Margaret liked, and one simply didn't develop the way she'd hoped. Margaret recorded those too. Thomas had warned her about becoming emotionally attached to her own breeding decisions. "If you only look for proof you're right, Maggie, you'll always find some." So Margaret looked for reasons she might be wrong. As calving season ended, however, she had something worth watching. The calves had generally arrived in the direction she'd hoped for, but birth was only one trait. Now came another test, growth. Margaret never expected a calf born more easily to somehow become large later by magic. Birth traits and later growth were related pieces of a much larger genetic picture, not the same measurement. That was why she'd spent so much time studying balance. Spring turned towards summer, and the calves grew some faster and some slower. Margaret weighed, recorded, and compared them within the reality of her own herd and management. One afternoon, Earl pointed toward a dark heifer. "When she was born, I thought you'd sacrifice too much calf." Margaret smiled. "And now?" She filled out. "That's why I didn't select on one number." Margaret opened her notebook. Calving ease mattered, useful growth mattered, and so did the cow raising the calf. For the females Margaret might keep, the real test hadn't even started. Temperament, mature size, fertility, the ability to raise a calf, and longevity, those answers required years. Earl pointed toward 3 heifers grazing together. "You selling those?" "No." "You need the money." "I do." "Then, why keep them?" Margaret watched one heifer move through the grass. Lot 47's calves had now answered 2 questions. Could they get here and could they grow? But the question that had made Margaret raise her paddle at the auction was still unanswered. Could his daughters become the kind of cows her farm needed? There was only one way to find out. She had to keep them long enough to become cows. By October, the calves were ready to leave. A buyer arrived shortly after sunrise and walked through the pasture with Margaret. He liked the steers. They showed good growth, looked healthy, and were uniform enough to put together as a group. Margaret listened while he talked numbers. She needed the check because winter hay wasn't going to buy itself. Then the buyer stopped. Across the pasture, 7 heifers stood near the water trough, all daughters of Lot 47. "What about those?" Margaret looked at them. "Not included." The buyer studied the heifers again. "I'll make you an offer." "No." "You haven't heard it. They're not for sale." His offer came anyway, and it was better than Margaret expected. For several seconds, she said nothing. That money could buy hay, repair the squeeze chute, or pay down another bill. 1 year earlier, Margaret might have accepted before he finished speaking. Instead, she looked at the heifers. She wasn't keeping all of Lot 47's daughters, because that would have defeated the purpose. Some didn't fit what she wanted. One was too nervous. Another hadn't grown as efficiently as the others, and Margaret had spent months recording which calves came from which cows, how they grew, and which females showed the combination she wanted to carry forward. The 7 near the trough had survived that process. The buyer increased his offer, but Margaret shook her head. "Still no." After he left, Earl came over. "Heard you turned down good money. News travels fast. You need hay." "I know. And you're keeping calves instead?" "Heifers." "Expensive heifers." Margaret smiled. "That's one way to look at them." Earl leaned against the fence. "What's the other?" Margaret opened Thomas's old notebook. Inside was the sentence that had started all of this. "Buy the cow you want 5 years from now." She handed it to Earl. He read it, then looked toward the heifers. "You think those are the cows?" "I think some of them might be." "Might?" Margaret nodded. That word mattered. They were still calves. None had carried a pregnancy, calved, or proven she could remain productive in Margaret's system. The real test was still years away. Earl handed the notebook back. "So the bull hasn't proved you right yet?" "No." Margaret watched one of the heifers lower her head into the grass. "He's only given me the chance to find out." That winter, the steers left the farm, and several other heifers left too, but those 7 stayed. They grew through another spring and another season, and slowly, almost too gradually for anyone outside the farm to notice, the calves Margaret had refused to sell stopped looking like calves and started looking like cows. 3 years after Margaret brought Lot 47 home, Earl stopped beside the west pasture. "Where'd those cows come from?" Margaret looked up. "Which ones?" He pointed towards 7 young females grazing with calves beside them. Margaret smiled. "You've met them before." Earl stared, then recognition came. The heifers? Lot 47's first daughters. They weren't calves anymore. They had bred, carried pregnancies, calved, and begun raising calves of their own. For the first time, Margaret could evaluate something far more important than how Lot 47's offspring looked at weaning. She could evaluate his daughters as cows. Number 31 lifted her head, and Earl remembered her. She was the little one. "Moderate," Margaret corrected. "Still smaller than some of your old cows." "That's intentional." Margaret wasn't trying to make every animal smaller. She wanted mature cows better matched to the forage, winter feed, and management her farm could realistically provide, but she refused to declare victory. These were young cows, and longevity and lifetime productivity hadn't been proven. 3 years could reveal direction, but Thomas's 5-year rule demanded patience, so Margaret kept records. Another breeding season passed, then another, and some daughters left the herd. They didn't all earn a permanent place, and that mattered as much as the ones that stayed. By the 5th year after the auction, the West pasture looked different, not dramatically, but functionally. More of Margaret's mature cow herd now descended from the replacement females she'd selected from Lot 47. Number 31 was still there, and so were several sisters. They had now produced multiple calves. Earl stood beside Margaret at the same gate, but this time he didn't ask where the cows had come from, because he already knew. Margaret handed him Thomas's notebook, and Earl read the sentence, "Buy the cow you want 5 years from now." Then he looked across the pasture. 5 years. Margaret nodded. For years, people had asked whether Lot 47's calves would prove her right, but they had been asking the wrong question. Calves were only possibilities. The real change came when selected heifers stayed, became cows, raised calves, and began occupying the places in Margaret's herd once held by the animals she was trying to move away from. 5 years earlier, Margaret had seen these cows only in her imagination. Now they were standing in front of her. Daniel Mercer didn't return because he'd suddenly remembered Margaret. He returned because he'd seen number 31's daughter. A cattle buyer had noticed the young female in a group at a regional sale and asked where she'd come from. The answer eventually led back to Margaret Hale and to Lot 47. 5 years after the auction, Daniel's truck appeared at Margaret's gate. She remembered his voice immediately. Thomas would have bought more bull than that. Daniel stepped out. "I've been hearing about your cows." Margaret smiled. "That's different from hearing about my bull." Apparently, that's the point. She opened the pasture gate, and Daniel studied the herd carefully, not just the calves, but the cows. He stopped when number 31 came into view with another calf beside her. "Whose daughter?" "Lot 47. Daniel turned. "That bull?" "That bull." He looked again. "What about those?" "His daughters, too." "All of them good?" Margaret laughed. "No." Daniel seemed surprised. "I sold some, culled some, and kept the ones that fit." So he didn't fix the herd. No bull fixes a herd. That answer changed the conversation. Margaret explained what 5 years had actually looked like. Records, selection, culling, breeding, grass, nutrition, and repeatedly choosing which genetics earned another generation. Lot 47 had supplied possibilities, while Margaret had applied selection. Daniel stared across the pasture. "I guess we missed something at that sale." Margaret shook her head. "You saw the bull." "What's that supposed to mean?" She pointed toward number 31. "I was trying to see her." Daniel remained quiet. At the auction, he'd evaluated the animal standing in the ring. Margaret had evaluated where that animal might move a herd over time. Daniel finally opened the sale catalog he'd brought. "I'm buying another bull next month." He offered Margaret the catalog. "Tell me which one." Margaret didn't take it. Instead, she asked, "What kind of cows are you trying to have 5 years from now?" Daniel looked at the catalog, then toward Margaret's herd and slowly closed it. For the first time since she'd known him, Daniel Mercer wasn't asking which bull was best. He was asking where his herd needed to go. 5 years after the auction, Margaret found Lot 47 beneath the old cottonwood. Gray had begun appearing around his face, and he moved more slowly now. Margaret rested her arms on the fence. Once everyone had stared at that bull. Now, Margaret looked past him. Across the pasture were cows carrying his genetics. Some were daughters, and among their calves were females Margaret was already evaluating as possible replacements for another generation. The herd wasn't perfect, and she distrusted that word now. Some of Lot 47's calves had disappointed her. Some daughters had been sold, while others had been culled. Dry summers had changed some plans, and management mistakes had changed others. Lot 47 hadn't transformed the herd by himself. No bull could. He had moved the genetic possibilities in a direction Margaret wanted. Then selection, management, grass, time, and repeated decisions had done the rest. That evening, Margaret opened Thomas's notebook. "Don't buy the bull for the cow standing in front of you. Buy the cow you want 5 years from now." Margaret looked toward number 31. 5 years earlier, she hadn't existed, but now she was a mature cow that had raised multiple calves. Beside her stood her current calf. Farther down the pasture grazed an older daughter of number 31 that Margaret had retained from an earlier calf crop. Margaret stopped. There it was, Lot 47's daughter, his granddaughter, and another generation beginning beside them. It wasn't a miracle, it was a direction carried forward. Thomas had understood that breeding decisions travel through time. A bull might work on a farm for only a few seasons, but if his daughters were retained, and if those daughters earned their place, his influence could remain long afterward. Margaret understood the lesson in another way, too. Thomas had been gone for years, yet she still heard his questions every time she opened a catalog. What does your land support? What does your herd need? What are you trying to build? Some things lasted because of what they left behind. Thomas had, and Lot 47 would too. The sun dropped behind the pasture, and Margaret watched a young heifer lift her head. She wasn't the biggest or the flashiest, and years earlier, Margaret might have overlooked her. Now she asked a different question, not, what is she worth today? But, what could she contribute tomorrow? Everyone at that auction thought the widow had bought the bull nobody wanted. They were wrong. Margaret had bought genetic possibilities, then spent 5 years testing them, selecting them, rejecting some, and carrying the best forward. Everyone else had been looking at the bull standing in front of them. Margaret had been looking beyond him, at cows that hadn't been born yet. If Margaret's story reminded you that the wisest decisions are not always the most impressive ones at first, tell us in the comments. Would you have bought Lot 47 or followed the crowd? If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss more stories about hardworking farmers, patient decisions, and the legacies built one generation at a time.